Welcome to Keep Going, a podcast about failure and success, hosted by John Biggs. Every week, we talk to an amazing person about a time they failed and what they learned. And remember, when you're going through hell, keep going.
Welcome back to Keep Going, a podcast about success and failure. I'm John Biggs. Today on the show we have Dan White, who's an improv pervert. He's one of the funniest guys I know on Twitter. And the reason why I brought you on, Dan, is because you're hilarious and I don't have enough joy in my life. So I need you to, A, teach me how to be happy again, and B, just tell me about your career and all the setbacks associated with trying to make a living at what you're trying to do and have kids. And I guess,
Yeah. Well, first off, John, does every guest comment on how efficient of an opening that is? That's like the most efficient on mic and off mic. Before I jumped on, you were like, all right, here's the premise. I need like a couple failure stories.
I have no
3,
time.
2, 1.
I have no time. Everybody wants to have like an interview beforehand, and they want to like discuss.
Of course,
they want
and
me
then
to
it
send
wastes
questions.
everyone's time. Yeah,
who has time for questions?
You're right. So, John and I truly, this is like within the first 5 minutes of us ever talking, and we're going to put it out into the world. So, for John, I should also say, has been so gracious. I was late to this Zoom and have been late and had to reschedule twice. So, thank you. I would say that's probably one of my biggest recent failures is my inability to keep a Google Calendar. But
just don't screw the rest of this up. And
I mean, in terms of failure, I think it's interesting. Like, I definitely have had moments in my life where I was hoping for a different outcome. But like failure is like weird, I think, in any sort of creative pursuit, because some of like I think some of my biggest failures are also things I guess when I think about it, have been kind of like breadcrumbs to keep going. I come from a very in high school and college, I ran track. And so like kind of my whole youth was it's like the opposite of any sort of creative field. It's like down, it's highly quantifiable what's good and what's not, right? And so like if I ran the 800, so it was like if I ran 148.2, and somebody else ran 148.1, I knew that they were 0.1 second better than me, right? And then so I lived, a decade of my life that way. And then you go into the creative like a sort of creative endeavor, and there's no metrics really that tell you what's good and what's bad. It's kind of your own. You're kind of like in the dark a little bit and just kind of feeling around. And so anytime you can touch something that you're like, I think I'm on the right track and this is what I should be doing, it's helpful. And then, as if that's not complicated enough, you see a million people who you don't think should have things that get things, and then also people who you think are fantastic, who kind of are in the same boat you are, where you're just waiting. And so I think some of my biggest like quote unquote failures were things that just were like, oh, you should keep going, because if you've gotten to this level, even if you didn't get the thing or whatever, like it means you're there for a reason. And I think that's very common. I tend to be more of a writer at this point in my career. I love acting and would love to get back to it, but I think acting is a lot more like that, where it's like if you're getting in the room with certain casting directors and stuff, that's their way of like telling you, like, even if you don't get the job, if you get really close or whatever, but they keep bringing you back, that's their way of saying like, you're doing the right thing. We just haven't, it just hasn't clicked or whatever. So I think one of my biggest failures, like a concrete example kind of along those lines, is probably in hindsight, from a creative standpoint, good that it didn't work out, but from a financial standpoint would have been nice. I was one of like, I think it was like 4 people or 5 people nationwide that they that was going to be the Jake from State Farm, like the Jake from those State Farm commercials.
Yeah.
I mean, at this point, he's made, multiple millions. I don't know how many, but that was something that I knew was huge at the time, and I felt like the audition I had was so good. Like in terms of I thought, I was like, I don't usually feel great about auditions. I'm usually like, oh, whatever. And that one, I was like, I think I did really well there. And they were like, I remember because it was like the second to last week of December. And I was waiting and waiting, and they were like, they're going to take the holidays to decide, and then they'll come back. And which meant that like it was like 2 weeks over the holidays. I was like with my family, just in the back of my head, like maybe I'll be a multimillionaire, maybe not. You know, like either like you either get it or you don't. And then also, I remember the other thing was I had known somebody who was on like the creative team who was like in charge of the spots, and so I was like, I got it in, like, I remember that being like, oh man, this could be like life changing money. And then I just got an email on like January 3rd that was like,
Wow.
hey, not going to be this one. Good luck. And that was like, that sucked. But what was funny is like later reading about it, the like head of State Farm, when they announced the big campaign, they had this like interview with the head of State Farm, and it was like, he was like, yeah, we had 4 guys we were deciding between, and we did this giant focus group, and it wasn't even close. The guy they picked, they were like, everybody loved him. He was like hands down the best, and it was like very nice for 99.9999999% of the population who wasn't one of the 4 guys who wasn't chosen to read that article and be like, oh, this is so great. What it's, you know, but if you're one of the 4 who's reading that, all you're hearing is like, we showed a lot of people, and like it wasn't just like a casting director decision. We like focus group this, and like America from all parts of the country does not like you.
We were fighting for Dan the whole time, but even if we put his name under everybody else's, like everybody else, they didn't like him.
Exactly.
Okay.
And then that was one of those things too. I'm a big college football fan, and so it was one of those things that to this day, anytime I watch any sporting event, I see inevitably the 4 or 5, you know, fucking State Farm commercials, and it's just a constant reminder of.
Okay.
Yeah.
So that's super. That's actually like a whole new form.
I have one other part of the story.
Okay, yeah, go for it.
I think I can say this.
Yeah, you can.
I hope this is okay. I'm like debating whether I had a friend. This was like within like the last like 6 months. I had a friend who didn't know about this story, and she was like, randomly in conversation, she's like, you know, in college, I used to live across from the State Farm guy. And I was like, yeah. And she's like, dude, he cleaned up. He like had so many girls, and like just like totally randomly unprompted was like, this guy was like such a ladies' man, like always, and not, you know, totally respectful, like, just like in college. I mean, he's a good looking guy. Like, and I was just like, man, I fucking, even like 5 years later, I'm still like getting reminded of just how much better this guy is in every way.
Okay, so this is a unique form of failure. I think this is important to share because it makes you look terrible. Like, this is the worst feasible thing I've ever heard on this show. I assure you. Like, losing out to like a ladies' man. Like everybody else literally lost like millions of dollars accidentally because they hired the wrong guy or something like that.
Oh, really?
You were so close to. Oh my God! All right. Well, first off,
I lost millions of dollars. I mean, by
potential dollars. It's potential energy
dollars,
versus
that's true.
Versus
that's
actual
true.
stored energy.
But to be fair, like I said, it was one of those things where I am, in hindsight, and probably for the best that I did.
Yeah,
the money would be great, but I wouldn't be able to do a lot of what I do now. That
exactly.
I find creatively fulfilling. Thank you, John. I appreciate that, man.
So, okay, so let's explore this slightly because I think this is vital because what you dealt with was completely different than other people deal with it, and you're still happy. You're still working. You're still doing your thing.
Yeah.
How do you bounce back from a situation where it's almost like winning the lottery, and you were so close to winning the lottery, you were like two numbers off? And I don't want to rub this in or anything, but this is actually a really important concept because for somebody like a creative, there's a lot of setbacks, right? And to keep maintaining that, especially with a smile on your face, seems difficult. What do you do aside from, I don't know, SSRIs?
Well, I'm not on SSRIs. No shame to anyone.
I can get you some, yeah.
But I would say one major thing about that I'm hyper aware of in my world. Like, losing that gig sucked for me from a financial standpoint, but I was aware even at the time where I was like, this gig is like going to preclude me from doing a lot of what I want to do. Right. Mm-hmm. there was no and no offense to the great folks at State Farm or whatever ad
No, they
agency wrote
suck.
those
They didn't hire you.
spots.
That's the worst.
No, they were actually very nice, and I will say,
Yeah,
like,
okay,
a
well.
lot of directors kind of suck in those things, like creatives. Like, it drives me nuts how bad commercial people can be sometimes, and they were exceptionally nice, and so I do give them that. They were very kind. But so no shame on them, but like ultimately, like, it's not a gig that I was like, it wasn't creatively fulfilling, right? Like, it
Sure.
was purely the paycheck. And so there are stories of like, oh, I can't remember the actor's name, which is like kind of makes the story even worse. Is that like there's like one actor who got cast, like the famous story, like Aragorn, I think from Lord of the Rings. Aragorn, that's how you pronounce it, right?
Yeah, Sean Bean.
No, it's Viggo Mortensen.
Viggo Mortensen. Yeah.
But before him, they cast a guy and they shot. So he got the gig. They flew him to New Zealand. They shot like 2 days. And Peter Jackson was like, he looks too young on camera. And they had to and that would be a whole other level of devastating.
Oh my God, yeah.
Because that's like you lose the money and the creative opportunity in a way that's like pretty hard. And so like I would say like for me, the closest to that would probably have been like auditioning for SNL, because that was like more of a thing where it's like wouldn't have made as much money right away, but like would have had like kind of the dream gig. And that's like you grew up, like I grew up loving SNL and grew up really like always dreaming of being on the show, like I think a lot of young comedians do. And so that was one where it's like, you get flown out and you do the thing on the stage and all that. It's super cool, and they're really, really nice. Or in my experience, were really nice. And then you just go home, and then it's like, oh, I didn't get it right. And that's harder because I stuck around in Chicago a couple years after that, and it was like then every cycle would go by, and you'd be like, oh, I'm not like gonna ever do this. And it's like every year it kind of hits you again, where you're like, I'm never gonna do that thing. And yeah, I mean that one's like, that's harder, I think, sometimes to be like, to get back up from. Like the gigs, like the commercial gigs sucked, and it took me a while to like lick my wounds just because think about the money. But like ultimately the money is easy to get past. It's the creative stuff where you're like, I don't know if I'm ever gonna get another shot at like doing this. And yeah, and so I think so much of it is like, I would say first and foremost in terms of like getting yourself back up, I think keeping perspective is huge. I'm very fortunate where like I have a great support system with like my wife is not in the biz and is just a very
And she has insurance, right?
She does have insurance. I've been fortunate. I worked in corporate America for 10 years. I was working at a corporate job when I like almost had both of these things. So I always had the like I liked everyone I worked with. I was never gonna like walk in and like flip my boss off. Like I was always on good terms with my bosses and stuff. But like it would have been so nice to just be like, I'm out.
I'm
like,
Jake from State Farm.
Yeah. But I never got that opportunity.
Well, there's always hope.
Yeah. But no, so like but yeah, she does have insurance, although I have insurance now too. We're very fortunate for now. But yeah, she's just like, I think mentally really stable, and she's not in the biz, and she's very confident, and like I think a lot of that rubs off on me because she's just like, she's never doubted things. And like I've asked a lot of her, and I've tried to do so in the most like responsible way possible, but she's always been supportive of like what I want to do, and was like, I think moving to LA from Chicago, like we both loved Chicago so much, and it was a big ask to be like, let's take our at that time 1-year-old daughter and move out to LA. And it had kind of always been the plan, but like the COVID and stuff kind of like delayed it and made it weird. And so it was very much like a leap of faith, and so far, at least for both of us, it seems to have paid off. And it led to ultimately, and the other thing I'll say too about some of that stuff, like so I should say, so my wife, and then also having kids, like kids are a lot, and like sometimes it's not easy, but I think it's made me better at managing like certain realities of the biz, of like jealousy and like frustrations and these things, like just because I think, especially when they're young, they're only young for a very short period of time. And so you become aware of like, and some days I'm better at this than others. I don't want to just make it seem like I'm a saint. Like some days I still have, the same struggles everyone else does. But like, I think the thing with kids is like, you just are like, well, what am I upset about? Like, this person got this job that I wanted, and you're like, well, you got so much other great stuff in your life. And like, ultimately, if I spend a day right now bummed about this, like not only am I not helping myself professionally, but like I'm wasting a day where tomorrow my kid's going to grow up and they're going to be bigger than they were today. And, and so I think like trying to keep that stuff in perspective is really helpful. And just, I think the support system and then coupling that with just like really putting the art above everything of like any way you can, of like, obviously everybody wants money and we all want to be financially successful at this thing. And it gets harder, I think, as you get older and people who make different decisions start to be validated financially or, status or whatever, like it becomes harder. But I think the reality is, you only kind of get one, not to get too hyperbolic with it, but like you only get one life. And so you pursue the thing you love and you try for as long as you can. And you just got to know that like it is hard and like there are going to be setbacks, and like ultimately if you really love the thing you're doing, it's easier to handle. And I think the things that really, like the thing I struggle with most, more like the thing that feels worse than like any sort of like jealousy over like they got this or this person got that or whatever, is like when I see something so great that I'm like, I don't know if I'm ever going to be able to do something that good. And that's the hardest part. There was a movie a few years back, Stupid and Futile Gesture, I think it was what it was called, with Will Forte on Netflix, about the Lampoon.
Oh
And
yeah,
there was
yeah.
a scene where they're all watching Airplane in the movie theater, and they walk out, and he's just like devastated because he's like, we're not going to make that movie. And that, to me, that movie is good. I like that movie quite a lot. But that scene specifically is something that I just think it was a rather underrated movie, but that scene specifically speaks to a feeling in art that I think is very universal and not always examined. And it's very hard to do because it, especially in comedy, it's like the merging of art and commerce
Yeah, there's
preclude a
like,
lot
well,
of very good things from getting made.
I mean,
So when you
there's
see
always
someone do it,
there's always the feeling that somebody's doing it better than you, right? There's always like Louis C.K. is
yeah.
like whatever,
Well, and I
selling
came
a
up in
stadiums.
Chicago when Tim Robinson was like
Oh wow,
a just a 20-something-year-old dude doing stuff on stage, and I'm always like, I just looked at that and was like, oh my god, like, is that feels like you were behind Michael Jordan and like didn't,
yeah.
but there was no metrics to know how good he was, and you're just like, why am I doing this? I'm never gonna be that good, It's just like, but that was like, he really was like such a generational
But
talent.
he's good, and he's good in a different way, right? So I feel like I have to like cheer you up, because I mean I think what you're good is like these little snippets that you're doing, especially the Twitter stuff. That's really good,
Oh, thanks,
and
man.
that's very specific. That's very specific to a certain genre. And I mean, look, it's how long does TV quote unquote last in its current form? How long does a show last?
Well,
The
that's what
next,
I'm employed doing right now, is writing for TV. So
yeah,
I
yeah.
hope a long time.
I was going to say, that's what I was going to say.
Yeah, as much
Yeah.
as I love Twitter, I have never made a cent off Twitter. So,
Okay.
and actually, it might have cost me the State Farm gig.
Yeah. Yeah. Actually, if they did a search, it would be there's some good stuff on there. Okay. Well, yeah. I'm sorry about that. Yeah. So great. TV's going to be here forever. Everybody's going to be fine. I keep telling myself
We'll see.
that's what journalism. I'm never going to be back in journalism again. I don't think this is like a
Yeah.
labor of love, doing this just to talk to interesting people and like tell stories like yours, which is amazing.
I think that's important. I mean, what's your feeling? Like, I mean, after working in journalism, like, do you have like a biggest failure that you talk about a lot on here?
Quitting and trying to do a startup, basically.
Oh, really?
I had a very specific career, right? So I was over at TechCrunch for a long time, which was a
Mhm.
sort of like a tech startup
Mhm.
publication, and I was at Gizmodo. And I thought I knew how to run a business, but I didn't. I realized pretty quickly that I was like completely clueless.
Sure.
And trying to do these things, there's certain things that I can do and certain things I can't. And like I could see the rest of the startup world. It's like populated by complete morons, but they're really, really good at like hiring people or figuring out a run rate or doing a business plan or all this other good stuff. So all the absolute worst people, and I'll say this out loud, all the absolute worst people are the ones who get, because they're psychopaths. So they're all stuck in they're stuck in their heads. There's one guy I know who basically flies constantly. He just goes to thing to thing, and I don't think he actually makes that much money. He's just so dedicated to this like concept that he's working on.
Yeah.
That he's all over the world, and he goes to clients and he sets all these things up, and then he goes back to New York and hangs out and then goes back. It's just like this endless cycle for him.
Sure.
But yeah, so in terms of that failure, should I have sat around and been a journalist instead of doing a startup? No, probably not, because I wouldn't have a lot of the insights that I have today.
Yeah.
And then, for example, I do another podcast occasionally with a friend of mine who won a Pulitzer over at the Daily News,
Oh wow.
and and now it's almost impossible for him and I to even get journalism jobs just because they don't want our style of journalism anymore. I mean, I can do a listicle with the best of them, but they just don't want us sitting around and moping about ethics or whatever. So
Yeah. I think it's interesting. I have a, not to be too much of a downer because I feel like you booked me as a comedian, but
yeah, you're still in
there.
TV.
Yeah, I mean, I have a lot of hope and optimism that storytelling, which is ultimately what I want to do, as much as I appreciate the compliment on the Twitter stuff. That's very fun and I love joke writing. But like, the storytelling element
Hmm.
of writing a script and developing characters and stuff like that, I think is the ultimate passion. I hope that there's always a place for that. I do think that there is this reality. It's interesting what you said about like the small business people. Like that's something I think is very true right now in general, even in art. And I think
Hmm.
America is a capitalist country. Like that's kind of how it's always been and how it's probably always going to be. But we put such a premium on business and these sort of things. And one thing that's bummed me out, and I don't mean to make it seem, because I will say, like, with the huge caveat of like Hollywood has always been broken. It's always been a
Hmm.
very terrible industry, very difficult industry in lots of ways. And so I don't mean to say like, oh, it was better 10 years ago. I definitely don't mean to imply that. But one thing I do think that's hard right now is when everybody has like an outlet. What ends up happening is a lot of times what you see in creative fields, similar to I think your startup example, is like the people who make it, and there are also some like huge geniuses. Like I always say, like I think like a Connor O'Malley is somebody who's like really carved out like this insane, like great following on social media and like knows what he's a genius, like in every
Hmm.
sense of the word, and he's figured out how to translate that. But I do think what you see a lot is like there are a lot of influencer types or people who make a lot of money on social media, YouTube, TikTok, whatever you want to throw it, like, and it doesn't always reward the most creative or the most artistic. It rewards the kind of like more like small business minded people.
Okay.
And so I feel like sometimes there are some brilliant artists I know, and I don't think it's ever been a strength of the artist community to be super business minded. I think business minded artists have always had success in Hollywood or in literature or in any other field, music, whatever. But I do think like this current iteration of it is that on steroids a little bit, where it's not always about who's making the best content or the most interesting content. It's about who's making the content where they've cracked the algorithm and can produce it regularly, where they create this chain of people. And sometimes
Yeah.
it's just about hard work. And, I don't mean to discredit them. It's just like a little bit to me a bummer where it's like it used to be a little bit more of like cracking this. And I could see why that would be frustrating in its own way, like this impossible code of what executives and what Hollywood wants and like the zeitgeist and you're trying versus now it's like people making stuff for an algorithm that's dictated by um, tech execs in San
Yeah.
Francisco and how do they make the most money, and then the form of comedy that an entire I filter it through comedy, but I think this is true for a lot of things of like the entire form that an entire generation is consuming now is built, to optimize like the ad dollars for digital companies. And, you can make the argument that's the same way with like commercial breaks or anything, but I think that is a little bit more of a, 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 a happy, coexistence of art and commerce versus now it just feels like it's so blatantly like
Yeah.
pushing like products and algorithms and stuff like that. But again, I don't mean to like make it seem like that's
No, no.
everything, but
Well,
I
I
just
think
think that's a reality of the current climate is that like people who are good at business tend to have more success than
well,
like
I don't
people
want
who
to I don't want to go down like the media rabbit hole, but I mean, what you're talking about is essentially the idea. Like when I started out, I was a journalist and I became a blogger, and that was
Mhm.
before anybody knew what a blog was. So I was writing 28 posts a day, pushing out content. And what happened with that, it kind of expanded into YouTuber. That was the next
Mhm.
step, Twitch streamer, YouTuber, and now it's influencers. So somebody like Marcus Brownlee, who was a tech tech YouTuber, has far less clout now, simply because the system has moved on. And then
Yeah.
and what you're dealing with in terms of TV, you're dealing with streaming. You're doing with what's the show, St. Dennis? What was
St.
your
Dennis
show?
Medical is the
Yeah,
show
St.
that I
Dennis
run.
Medical. So you're dealing with streaming. You're dealing with entirely new medium that might not be familiar to, especially folks who are used to telling stories in a linear way, who are used to telling stories where, I don't know, there's not a rotating digital cat involved in the joke. There's all kinds of goofy stuff that
Well,
the kids like.
yeah, I mean, look, I think that's like, yeah, I think it's hard because I think there's a couple things happening right now, but like, I think one of the frustrating things, I think one of the frustrating things in television in general right now with streaming is how like we are just in like a transitionary phase where like we're
Mhm.
figuring out what it's going to be, and it seems like what it's going to be is a lot like what it used to be, but less profitable for a lot of people. Um, which is frustrating because like I think it's just like, you know, that's what a lot of tech has done to a lot of industries is like they've come in and they've kind of and again, I think like it's a lot better in a lot of ways and offers like a lot more unique stuff. Like I think there are programs that exist now that wouldn't have existed 10-15 years ago, and things that I love, you know, like like I'm a huge fan of a lot of what Hulu does, like a lot of the FX shows on Hulu. Like
Mhm.
I've watched the rest of like What We Do in the Shadows, and I watched English Teacher, and I love these shows. I loved Pen 15, like a lot of these comedies, and like a lot of these shows, like maybe Comedy Central, like some of them, but like I think like there's just like new opportunities, and they're giving like new like platforms to these really interesting voices, and so there's a lot of good that comes with it. But I think the bad just comes at less of like a creative level where there's like a lot of execs who are very talented and want to make stuff, and more of this like corporate level. And I don't think I'm speaking out of turn here because there was a great interview with John Landgraf on The Town a couple months ago, who's obviously much more brilliant than I'll ever be, but he talked a lot about this, and it really changed my framing of the perspective of like how content is made and like what the job of these networks are. And he just talked about an executive's job to like to tap into the zeitgeist and try to find an artist who's like
Mhm.
who's connecting. And so like and he was very anti algorithm decision making, and I think like that's a very common source of frustration and friction right now in the industry. Is like he made the point where he's like, an algorithm can tell you what's worked in the past, but not necessarily what's going to work in the future. And I really love that, and that stuck with me. And so everyone wants to quantify everything, and I know that there's value in that. But I think the risk is like you just you lose out on some really interesting stuff that might have existed had there been a little bit more of a risk taking mindset. So I don't think I'm
That's
saying anything that hasn't been said a million
no,
times in
no, that's
much more
great.
eloquent terms.
Well, Dan, this has been great. I think your story is really unique, and it'll make a lot of people feel better, and b it shows an entirely different view of what you went through, and that you popped out the other end just fine is amazing to me. I think that's really it's a testament to your strength.
Thank you. Can I say one last thing about failure that I think is somewhat
Yeah,
interesting? I know we're kind of out of time here, but
that's all
there's
right.
this kind of not to get too hippy dippy with it, like, but I am from the Chicago improv community, and there's kind of this idea that like failure can oftentimes be the thing that becomes the funniest part of a show, right? Is like a
Hmm.
mistake is like if you treat it as like you give it the import that it deserves, that it can actually make things better. And so I think to some degree, I think you have to look at life, especially if you choose a life in a creative field. There's so few people that it just line, and even the ones that it looks like it does, it doesn't. Like it looks like it lines up for or whatever. Like I think I'm probably an example of somebody like I moved to LA and got a job probably a lot quicker than most people did, but like I'd been in Chicago almost 10 years, like
Hmm.
grinding out and doing stuff. And so like you have to treat every failure as like, it can be the thing that can, lead to a much more rewarding success in the long run. And hopefully, and also if you're in a creative field, Hollywood owes you nothing, and it's
Yeah,
it's
and
impossible for everybody. So like
and
I
and
wouldn't.
AI is coming for everybody anyway. So
We'll
so
see. Microsoft just cut all the funding on those server farms. So.
Yeah, well, that's a whatchamacallit. Well, they're juking, I guess, to confuse people. No, you'll see. It's going to be awful. Anyway,
all right.
Dan White, you're at Dan White on Twitter. I want people to read your stuff. You're hilarious. St. Dennis Medical is the show.
Feed it into
ChatGPT
so that you can have it create your own Dan White tweets, and then you don't need me.
What I wrote is I actually wrote a thing that rewrites like popular tweets that have already been popular.
Yeah.
So what I'll do is I'll just rewrite yours, and
That's
I'll run it through Dolly as well, so it'll all look really messy and gross.
Oh,
and
so cool!
And can you imagine how much money I'm going to get from that?
Yeah, about as much as I got from it.
Dan, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me, John. This was fun.
All right, this has been Keep Going, a podcast about success and failure. I'm John Biggs. We'll see you. Thank you for listening to Keep Going, a podcast about success and failure. Remember, Keep Going is entirely listener supported. If you're listening to this, please head over to keepgoingpod.com, where you can subscribe to the podcast for as little as $5 a month. This is a labor of love, and every little bit helps. Thanks for listening.